Okay, we've been talking about the pure exchange model in the last lecture, and we went through the basic assumptions of the model. We created a picture of it by creating the Edgewood box, and we worked out the basic implications or the results of the model kind of in a technical way. But today, what I'm going to do is we're going to kind of re-examine that model, and we're going to think harder about the assumptions that are necessary in order to guarantee the conclusions that arise in that particular model. So we're going to talk a lot about what are the assumptions, what are the implications, and how can we use this model to help us make sense about the real world. We're also going to talk about some controversies and some issues out there in the world that this model is actually going to give us some insight about and some ways of understanding it a little bit better and understanding some of the controversies that are out there. So this is a very exciting lecture for me because it's a lot of new material, or at least material that you wouldn't traditionally get in an introductory economics class. But increasingly, I think this material is critical for understanding the economics approach to things and learning how to use models to better interpret and understand the world around us. And let's go. Okay, the pure exchange model has a presumption, an assumption that the individual agents are self-interested. And the first thing I want to suggest to you is that the self-interest requirement, it's a requirement. It has to happen, or else the trade that we're demonstrating in this particular model would not take place. All right. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to relax the assumption. I use that terminology. What relaxing means is that I'm going to change one assumption of the model, and we're going to see how logically that's going to lead us potentially to a different result. Now, if we relax an assumption and it doesn't seem to necessarily change the result, then we would call that assumption inconsequential. It doesn't matter really to the result model. So, for example, if I change the names of the agents from Smith and Jones to Brown and White, well, that's not going to change our final conclusions of the model. It's just going to mean we use different names to refer to the individual traders, right? Okay, but if, as I'm suggesting in this slide, we imagine that Smith is indeed self-interested, trying to raise his utility through trade, but let's suppose Jones believes in self-sufficiency. Now, self-sufficiency would mean he's reluctant to trade. He believes that maybe there's some dangers associated with it. Maybe he grew up in a family and his parents said, you know, be careful about others. They might deceive you, something we're going to talk about a little bit later today. But don't get involved with other folks. Don't trade. In that case, what would happen in the model if Smith and Jones came together with their 10 apples and 10 oranges? Well, they might talk to each other. Smith might present a terms of trade and say, tell you what, I'll give you 5 oranges for 5 apples. But Jones is going to say no to that because his belief is not to make himself better off through changes in his consumption bundle. Instead, he's going to say, no, I've got to be self-sufficient. I'm going to just produce what I can produce, and I'm not going to get involved in this trading issue. So trade would not occur. And if trade doesn't occur, well, then Smith doesn't get any surplus from trade, and Jones doesn't get any surplus. But Jones is happy with that because he's fulfilling his motivation, which is to maintain self-sufficiency. Okay, so this is a clear, I hope, example of how when you change one of the assumptions of the model, it can have a big effect upon what the outcome of the model. In fact, the outcome would not even arise if one of the agents was not self-interested. So we need the assumption that both of them are actually interested in fulfilling their own needs. They're self-interested actors in trade in order for the outcome to arise. All right, now the next thing I want to touch upon is the issue of whether trade is really maximizing utility for the individual agents. Now, we presented a couple of assumptions here in terms of, and I'm going to clarify this later, about the motivation. And at first, we said Smith and Jones were just interested in increasing their utility. But then we introduced the stronger assumption that they were actually trying to maximize their utility. Right? And we then demonstrated the outcome of that particular result by trading from a point like E to a point like S with certain marginal conditions, marginal rates of substitution equals to the terms of trade, and so forth and so on, right? So we showed that they would trade to some place like H, for example, in this particular Edgeworth box that's on display. They would trade to a point like H, and that would maximize both Smith's and Jones's utility according to the exercise. But we have to ask, and I want to look carefully at this. Now that we've got this Edgeworth box in front of us, we could ask, is a point like H, if it fulfills those maximizing conditions, is it really maximizing the utility of Smith? And the answer to that really is no, it's not. And the reason is because, well, look at the diagram. Smith is actually best at this point up here, K. because at point K, Smith would have all of the oranges and all of the apples. And that has to, because of the more is better assumption, that has to give him a much higher level of utility than a point like H in the middle. So how is it that he's maximizing his utility, but he's not really? He's ending up somewhere in the middle instead. And the same thing could be said for Jones. Is Jones's best point somewhere in the middle like A? Well, the answer to that is no. Jones's best point is down here at A, because at A, Jones would have all the apples and all the oranges, right? So how is it that they're maximizing utility and achieving a point like H somewhere in the middle of the lens? Well, the answer to that is that we assume in that maximization exercise, that again is done mathematically in the background, that Smith and Jones take a terms of trade as given and then decide how many apples for how many oranges or vice versa they're willing to trade. Now, by taking a terms of trade as given, it means that we're imagining up front that Smith and Jones are going to trade, that's how they're going to engage with each other. And by doing that, we are taking away the possibility that they could move from a point like E to K or to A. And in fact, moving from E to K, for example, is not trade. Yeah, so movement from E to K, from E to A or to EA is not trade, because let's say we moved from E down here to K and ask, well, what actually is happening in that particular movement of bundles? And the answer is that Jones is giving over 10 apples to Smith and getting absolutely nothing in return. The fact he's getting nothing in return means there's no trade. So movement from E to the other endpoints or corners is not considered trade. It would not be a terms of trade because there is no so-called quid pro quo. Quid pro quo is a this for that. I give you one thing, you give me something else. That's what we're describing in a trading relationship. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, Francis Edgewood, this is the guy who the Edgeworth box is named after. An old economist, dates back to the 1800s, born in 1845, died in 1926. He said in his Mathematical Psychics book in 1881, listed down here, he said the first principle of economics is that every agent is actuated only by self-interest. Yeah, that's the point I just made earlier. He said the workings of this principle, though, may be viewed under two aspects, according as the agent acts without or with the consent of others affected by his actions. Now, he says, in wide senses, the first species of action may be called war, and the second, contract. Now, this is old-time writing, and it's a little bit awkward. It's not the way we might write about this in a modern sense. So let me explain. Contract, what he's referring to is an agreement between two individuals. And he's really describing trading. It's like, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 5 oranges if you 5 apples. That is a contract. Or an alternative is sometimes trade takes place over time, like when you borrow money. I'll give you $100 today if you promise to pay me back $105 next year. All right, so that's a contract, an agreement you're entering into and making trade over time. War. What is war referring to? Well, he's referring here to the taking of goods by force or with superior power. That's how you can move from a point like E to a point A. One way to get there is for Smith to simply hit Jones over the head with a club and walk away with all of his apples. Or Jones might show up at the market with a club and Smith might show up at a club and they can just battle it out. And the winner gets to go home with all the apples and all the oranges. Now, that is a possible way in which a reallocation of the goods can occur. But I want to emphasize that when we build the model and we talk about individuals trading, we are a set away. We're saying that's not how they're going to engage with each other. So that means we've actually got an implicit assumption to cooperate and trade with each other. The pure exchange model, as we presented it, assumes that they engage in contract, not war. Okay, so what does that mean? That has some implications. It means they accept property rights. That's like saying, I'm going to come to the market, and what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, until or unless we engage in mutually voluntary trade. That's the key to the model. Both sides have to be willing to give and receive from each other in order for trade to occur, and represents an acceptance of property right. It is also accepting a moral kind of premise or code. We normally phrase it as thou shalt not steal, try to take away things from others using violence. They agree, last bullet point, not to use force or coercion or violence or threats against the other in order to gain an advantage and try to acquire all of the goods. That's what it means not to engage in war, but to engage in contract instead. All right, so we didn't present the model at first like this. We presented this as if, oh, well, individuals are just going to trade mutually voluntary. Let's move on from there. But there are these implicit ethical assumptions that are being made that we ought to take note of, and we're doing that right now. What if they don't accept contract? What if they come to the market and they're willing to engage in violence or coercion or theft? Well, if theft and violence occur, then the outcome is not going to be win-win. It's more likely, of course, to be win-lose, where one agent goes away with all of the spoils from the battle, and the other one goes away with nothing, and perhaps with injuries. The more powerful agent is going to gain in that particular war exchange, not an exchange, a war outcome, and the other is going to lose. So if there's a threat of violence and coercion at the market also, individuals are quite unlikely to go to the market. So if you go there the first time and Smith hits you over the head and takes all your apples, well, if I'm Jones, I'm not going back to meet him next week, because quite likely the same thing is going to happen again. And that means if violence like this, if war occurs instead of trade at the marketplace, then people are going to stop trading. And stop trading means they're not going to get the potential gains from trade that are represented in the pure exchange model. They can't both walk away winners because one has decided to engage in violence or force against the other, and then that's going to close off the entire market process entirely. Okay? So we've got to assume these particular things in order for trade to actually occur. We've also now relaxed the assumption of mutually voluntary exchange and note that the outcome is likely to be different. So that assumption is critical to the outcome. It's consequential, we would say, to the outcome. That assumption is very important in order to be assured that we're going to get these gains from trade as a result of trade. Let's do it again. Let's talk about the assumption prohibiting deception. Now here, what we're going to do is relax or change the perfect information assumption. Now, the perfect information assumption says that the agents know perfectly their preferences, first of all, but they also know perfectly the quality of the other goods that they're going to get in exchange. They need to know it in order to plug it into their utility function, find out what indifference curve they're going to fall on, and know whether they're actually going to end up better off from trade or worse off from trade. All right? So you need good knowledge about the goods you're trading for if you're actually going to win as a result of the trade that you're undertaking. All right? But what if they don't know perfectly the quality of the goods? Okay, so we're taking the pure exchange model with a set of assumptions. Now we're going to relax one of the assumptions and think about how it changes the outcome. So now I'm Smith, and I don't really know the quality of the apples that Jones is trying to sell to me. And maybe I won't know. Maybe it's a big bag of apples, and I don't have time to go through all of them and to check to see which are good and which are bad. I just don't know whether I can trust what Jones is giving to me, right? What happens? Well, imperfect knowledge about the goods you're trading for is going to open up the door for agents to deceive each other. Right? Agents might say, oh, well, my goods are fantastic. The apples are wonderful. You're really going to enjoy them. They taste really, really sweet. Well, if they say that when they're not really of that particular quality, then you've got a trader that's willing to try to deceive the individual on the other side, trying to give him or her information that's not valid or true. They might embellish the qualities of good, make it sound much better than it really is. And I give you an example. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. If you eat apples, it's going to be good for your health. Maybe, maybe not. All of these are things that make it difficult to know whether the goods you're going to get in exchange are really the quality you expect to get. And that means that individual traders might deceive each other. All right, what happens if they do? Well, if agents use deception, trade may occur because you may still go and say, well, I'm not sure whether I can trust Jones and whether the quality of his apples are as good as I think, but I expect them to be, and I expect they're going to make me happier as a result of the trade. Your trade, in other words, in a world of imperfect information, is going to be based on what you expect to get as a result of the trade that you're making. All right, so you may still trade, but you may find after you go home and open up the box of apples that not all of them are as good as you expected. And that might mean that your utility is either less than you expected it to be, or maybe even reduced. So in this circumstance, trade doesn't necessarily lower the welfare of both traders. It might just lower it relative to what was expected. Or if one agent is really deceptive, they say they're going to give you these goods in exchange next week, and then they arrive. Well, now they've deceived you and stolen from you at the same time. Now your welfare is actually going down relative to entering into a potential trade with this particular individual. Okay, so with deception, the outcome might be reversed, or at least the amount of utility you're going to get is going to be diminished as a result of the deception by the other party. might worry less about deception in markets or in contexts where trade is regular. If you go to a farmer's market, for example, and every week there's the same merchant selling similar products from their farms and their gardens and houses, well, you have a chance to buy something once, see if you like it, come back and buy it again. And if you're a merchant that's trying to sell a good to a set of customers and have repeat customers, well, deception is not going to be a good business model for you, because people are going to quickly realize that you're not to be trusted, and therefore you won't get repeat business. So oftentimes in the real world, when we do see deceptive practices, they're often one-off. It's like someone's going to deceive somebody, and if they can deceive them once and get some money from them, well, then they move on to other customers and they try to deceive somebody else. So they're not looking for repeat business, but they're looking for enough business from enough people they can deceive to maybe make a profit and to make money from them. I want to give you some highlights here and some configurations of how to think about the assumptions. So when we build up the economic model of the pure exchange model, for example, we make the assumption that trade is mutually voluntary. They're pursuing their self-interest and they will trade mutually voluntarily. All right, well, that's equivalent to saying that they accept property rights. It's equivalent to saying that there's no theft involved. There's no force or threats of force. There's no coercion, no intimidation. There's no injury or violence occurring to try to acquire goods than you're agreeing to in the mutually voluntary trade. All right, so we're assuming that people act ethically in these particular ways when we say trade is mutually voluntary. We're also assuming, down at the bottom, last bullet point on the right, that individuals are free to trade or not. Now, this happens in real markets, right? You can walk into a store, and if you like, you can walk out without buying anything. You're not being forced to trade, and you're not being forced to trade at a particular terms of trade. You're free to trade or not trade if you so desire. And that's a part of the implicit assumptions of this particular model. The second economic assumption we make is that there's perfect information, right? Now, what does that mean in terms of its ethics equivalent? Well, it's saying then, if there is perfect information, we're imagining that there is no lying or deception that's possible. Because if agents really know what they're getting, then the others are representing their products accurately and appropriately. They're telling you what it is they're selling you and what qualities it has, or giving you the opportunity to test it and see for yourself whether it's something that's going to satisfy your utility, okay? We're also imagining, under perfect information, that promises are kept. So having perfect information means that if I decide to lend you money, perfect information means I know that you're good to your word and that you're going to pay me back in the future what you promised to pay me back, maybe with interest. Okay, so we're assuming that those sorts of things can just be taken for granted, that promises are going to be kept. Agents are going to follow through on their transactions. Or another way to say it, and this becomes true in a more complicated real-world setting, that individuals are going to fulfill the contracts that they make with each other. So if you're going to build a house, for example, you're going to have a general contractor who's going to go out there and they're going to find all sorts of individuals who are going to come together to produce a particular thing, and they're going to sign agreements. They're going to say, I'm going to pay you so much for your fulfillment of this particular service. And then agents presumably will follow through on that if information is perfect and there's no threat or possibility of lying or deception or fraud in the context of that situation. All right, so that's the conclusion here, is that the ethical behavior of individuals in the marketplace is critical in order to get the results that we're displaying in the pure exchange model. Let's think about that a little bit more. Here's the pure exchange model implication. So we could say if two people pursuing only their individual self-interest trade X for Y, two different goods, with each other, they do it mutually voluntarily and with perfect information, this is the economics description of the assumptions, then we conclude that both traders are going to benefit from trade. And well, I would describe that the trade or exchange is a win-win situation, where win-win is referring to the gain that's being made by Smith, higher indifference curve, the gain that's being made by Jones, higher indifference curve. Win-win outcomes are arising because of that trade. Now, let's generalize this. Every day around the world, there are billions and billions, maybe trillions of transactions that are taking place between individuals. Every time you walk into a store, you're making a decision to give the merchant money in exchange for the good that you're receiving. I walk into a restaurant and I buy a sandwich. Well, I'm receiving a sandwich in that exchange, and I'm doing so because the sandwich is making me happier than holding money in my pocket. And the merchant is discovering that having the money in their pocket is more valuable, gives them more utility than having the sandwich at that particular moment. So when I make an exchange for a sandwich with the restaurant or the merchant, I'm becoming better off and the merchant is becoming better off. And then we think about spreading that out across the world where billions and billions of transactions are occurring to the extent that the above conditions are prevailing, then all of this activity is raising the well-being of everybody involved in the exchange. We've got happiness generation going around, and it's coming about because of the process of exchange. That's a pretty powerful conclusion because remember, Adam Smith said that what's motivating the merchants to behave, to act in the marketplace is their self-interest only. But what we're showing here is that if individuals pursue their self-interest only, but they follow these particular assumptions, then everybody is becoming better off as a result of that particular market activity. So trade is not a win-lose situation where one person gains, the other loses. That's war. Trade is a mutually beneficial outcome where everybody is benefiting. And we can multiply those benefits across the world every day with every transaction that's occurring, again, to the extent that those assumptions are fulfilled.